The polls came fast and furious during the campaign that was. Now the only poll that really counts is in the books. Joining us now for a look behind the numbers, here's Greg Lyle, Managing Director at the Innovative Research Group, and we welcome you from your perch in British Columbia to our studio here in Toronto. I want you to start by taking us back, because where we ended up and where we started on August 3rd, not similar at all.
Not at all.
Help us understand it.
Well, the big thing at the start of this campaign was that Thomas Mulcair, to the surprise of many people, had actually entered the campaign with more support than Jack Layton had at the end of the previous campaign. Part of that was a momentum factor with the Alberta election, but part of it was that Thomas Mulcair was very well regarded and remains very well regarded. He has equal to favorables of Justin Trudeau at this point in time, even though he just lost 70 seats.
So where do you think it started to go off the rails for them and on the rails for the Liberals?
There were two steps to it. The first step was Justin Trudeau had a very good August that it involved two key things. Number one, he more than beat expectations when it came to things like debates. He exceeded. And in some of the debates, he won hands down. In all the debates, he beat expectations. But in some debates, he took the people that were supposed to carve him up and carved them up instead.
And the
did
numbers,
very well.
You did polling and you have numbers that indicate that.
We polled on all 5 debates, and in no debate did Trudeau lose, and in several debates he won hands down, and in every debate he had many more that thought he did better than they expected them worse. The second thing was the ads. And the Liberals broke a number of rules in this campaign. The first rule they broke was they repeated the charge. So in the pre-writ, the Tories have been very effective with their job interview ad. But then Harper turned it on them by saying, Stephen Harper says, I'm not ready. Well, I'm not ready for this, I'm not ready for that. And, there were two things in that. Number one, everyone had already heard the charge. You couldn't make it worse by repeating it. Secondly, a lot of people that weren't necessarily Liberals, but weren't Tories, said, well, geez, if Harper doesn't like him, maybe he's okay. And what he's saying, I like. So
when he goes to camera and he says, I'll tell you what I'm not ready for. I'm not ready
gold.
to...
It's gold.
Yeah.
And what happened is not only did he pull votes from the Tories over to the Liberals, he pulled votes from the NDP to the Liberals without saying anything about the NDP. It was a remarkable ad, one of the best we've ever seen.
I don't know if you've polled on this, but conventional wisdom says that during 1 week in the campaign, the Liberals pledged to go into deficit. The New Democrats pledged to keep the budget balanced, a la the Harper Conservatives.
And it was a key moment.
It was key. Huh?
Absolutely key. Essentially what it did is it took the cuffs off the Liberals in terms of making promises, right? So the Liberals were able to promise real change now. And the NDP, and this really became clear by the time we hit the 3rd week of September, but the NDP were forced to say some change someday. And real change now beats some change someday 10 times out of 10. So a couple of things came out of that. Number one, the Liberals had a second killer ad, which was the one with the escalator. Again, they broke the rules, right? You're not supposed to be able to have an ad that needs the sound on for the ad to work, right? But apparently people listen to TV with the sound on, which is good news for this show. So people saw the ad, they loved the ad. Again, it worked really well.
Can I ask you about that? Yep. Why did that ad work? Because I know, I watched the ad with some people who looked at it and said, boy, that's hokey. How come? What did you see, or what did other people see?
Well, I mean, in my personal view, I didn't think it was the best ad. But what we saw when we tested it was that it actually moved people. And in particular, what it did is it brought a lot of Liberal defectors back. The Liberals, the reason the NDP were so strong at the start was because they had 20% of people that said that they felt closest to the Liberals voting for the NDP. And that was one of the ads that moved people over.
How about the niqab in Quebec? Everybody says the conventional wisdom is that once Mulcair opposed Harper's position on that, things started to go into the tank for him.
Right, and so we tested that. And it turns out that, Quebec New Democrats were not as thrilled about his position as the rest of the country was. And frankly, overall, people generally disagreed with him on his position, but a lot of people respected him for taking it. The issue with the niqab in Quebec is that it mobilized the Bloc voters. So there was an increasing group of people in Quebec that had moved onto the fence, that were unaligned with any party. And what the niqab did is a lot like what the culture debate in 2008 did. It allowed the Bloc to say, this is wrong for Quebec, we're standing up for Quebec. And they grew 10 points in a week on the question of what party understands the needs of people like me. And so a bunch of people jumped off the fence and joined them. No New Democrats moved over. The New Democrats stayed solid. But the other thing that happened that week in Quebec, like the rest of Canada, is the Liberals moved up on things like positive change, standing up for the middle class and creating jobs. It just didn't turn into votes that week because everyone was talking about the NECOP. As soon as people stopped talking about the NECOP, then the Liberals grew, and they grew at the expense of the NDP. So there's a bit of a misunderstanding. The NDP did lose ground in Quebec, but they didn't lose it to the Bloc. They lost it to the Liberals.
The one thing that we have heard both in the discussion just had, and of course, we're here in Toronto, so perhaps wherever you go, people came not to like the tone of Stephen Harper and the government.
Right.
Did you pick that up in polling?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we did, Stephen Harper was trying to do what Kathleen Wynne did. He was trying to get people that started off mad at him to end up afraid of the opposition. But what happened at the end of the day is that both the NDP and the Liberals inspired much more hope than the Tories did. And the Tories had much more fear of being reelected than anyone was afraid of the opposition parties. The other thing that was really big in this exercise, by the way, that's really important to Ontarians, is that what the Liberals did federally is exactly what Kathleen Wynne did provincially. Kathleen Wynne moved to the left of the NDP and ended up winning a majority of support on the left, and that's exactly what Trudeau did. Trudeau won more votes from the core left values group than the NDP did at the end of the campaign.
Is that a new normal, or is that a one-off?
Well, I find it very unlikely that the NDP, having been fooled twice, could be fooled a third time on that, but we'll see.
You never know. I mean, the party takes its cues from the leader in many respects this time.
Sure.
So,
I mean, and for sure, I mean, you know, you take a look at this, it was, I mean, one of the challenges probably the NDP had is that there's conventional wisdom that opposition should not get in the way of a government defeating themselves. And the truth is that they had very strong numbers at the start, and Trudeau had very weak numbers at the start. So their initial position made some sense, but once they saw Trudeau's favorables recover, which suggested he then had some momentum to move on, why they didn't reconsider their strategy is a big question.
let me ask you about when you knew it was a majority government, because all of the polls that I saw leading right to the election was on a Monday. Okay, the previous Friday, I didn't hear anybody saying there was going to be a majority government. Everybody was still saying, well, probably liberal minority, depending on the splits, might even be a conservative minority. When did you know it was a majority?
Well, I didn't know for sure it was a majority, but what I knew was that we weren't, but the people that do seat models were projecting the results based on the patterns of the last election. But the last election was a complete exception to the rule in Canada. We saw the highest NDP vote in the history of Canada and the lowest Liberal vote in the history of Canada. We ran our models two different ways, one by regions like the way everyone else did, and one where we combined seats that had similar results, and we found a 46-seat difference in the margin between the Tories and the Liberals in the regional model and the Tories and the Liberals on this alternate model. And so we wrote with 10 days to go, expect surprises because the seat models are off.
Huh. And it ended up being, I mean, what, it was 80-plus seat difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Huh, okay. How did the pollsters do?
Well, the pollsters did quite well. If you take a look at, for instance, 308, the average poll number for the ones that he had at the end of the campaign were all within 2 points of all the parties. And if you look at the Nanos numbers, and Nick was the only guy, the only pollster who was funded by the media to be able to afford land and sell live caller interviews, he was almost dead on the last day with a sample of 800. So the polls worked well, but the estimates of seats were off because people were using the wrong patterns.
We still can't, with any great confidence, extrapolate total vote to seat count, can we?
No, because it's a matter of where those votes are, right? So, I mean, I ran a campaign in BC in 1996 where we won the election by 60,000 votes and we lost it by 6 seats. It's a pretty tough night.
Let's finish up on this. Do you think the polls influence the voters or the other way around?
Well, clearly, voters are prepared to surprise pollsters, right? So just look at the last BC election and 2 elections ago in Alberta. So I don't think that the polls determine the future, but voters use the polls to do things like strategic voting. So for instance, we found that there was about 16–17% of the electorate that was in a position to vote strategically. They had a first choice, they had a second choice, and they thought their second choice had a much better chance of winning than their first. But only about 5% of the electorate actually does vote strategically. To do that, they need to know who's ahead, and part of the information they use for that is the polls.
Your polling. Gotcha. Greg Lyle, always good to have you in our studio. Thanks so
Very
much.
much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.